Hey guys, it's Ted Bogert. Welcome back to the TED Show. We've got a busy Monday for you, but we're wrapping it up. I love this topic. We are going to talk about the continuing tragedy of the Florida manatee crisis. And we have the one and only Dr. Jones is with us, and she's going to share what's going on, why it's important for us to pay attention and try to fix this tragedy and this crisis with the beautiful manatees, and so much more. Welcome, Dr. Jones. How are you this morning? Or this afternoon, I guess.
I'm wonderful. Thank you so much, Ted, for having me on.
I'm very excited to have you on. When Wendy told me what you do, I was sold, and hopefully Wendy Cohen will be on shortly. So before we went live, I said the audience loves origin stories. So before we take a deep dive into the manatee crisis, let's learn about you, like your journey and why manatees are important to you, kind of that whole 411 background.
Well, I guess the brief story, because it could be really, really long, but the brief story is that I became interested in marine mammal science when I was finishing up my bachelor's degree at the University of Florida. I was actually going to go to vet school, had wanted to be a veterinarian my entire life. And when it got to the time when I was wrapping up my bachelor's degree, interestingly enough, I went to talk to the dean of the vet school. He didn't like the fact that I had taken several of my chemistry courses and physics courses, which they don't even use in vet school, at the community college. And he said, well, why don't you go get your master's and then come back and apply for vet school? So probably the best thing that ever happened to me.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, because I went in search of a gentleman who had done, the only person at UF who had anything in his resume mentioning marine mammals. And long story short, he brought me into the manatee research world. And that was how I started my journey doing manatee research and just being a marine mammal behavior scientist.
I love the fact when something changes the trajectory of your life without you knowing it. I love that you had a dream to be a vet, and then somebody seemingly crushed it, but it ended up being, or at least postponed it, which is crushing when you really want to start. I understand. Exactly. But look how it all worked out for the best. You're now doing what I feel like you were meant to do, which is still working with animals and mammal and animal life. Talk about why this topic is coming up today. Why I think a lot of people hear about the manatees. They hear about the population decrease. They hear about all of the boaters. They hear about the freeze. There's so much different information that goes on out there. Give us an update on what's actually really happening from somebody who's in the know.
Okay. One of the reasons why I really appreciate you having me on the show was I would like to share with the public some of the information that is clarify, I should say, some of the misinformation that they're receiving in the media. Currently, as the media has mentioned, there have been over 300 manatees that have died just in 2022 alone in Brevard County. And that was the equivalent of how many died across the entire year of 2021.
Wow.
The problem is that they are starving to death for multiple reasons. But one of the main things is that what they're being fed in the feeding program isn't sufficient to bring a starving animal back. The FWC is attempting to, they're going through the motions of trying to help the population. The problem is that if lettuce were something that a starving animal could become healthy on, well, then models and actresses would never touch it, because I remember reading one of the FWC officials said to the newspaper that fat has more lettuce in it than hydrilla and water hyacinth. And again, models and actresses would never touch it if it had that much fat.
That's right.
So part of the problem is that feeding them lettuce is basically just like feeding us Cheetos. If we were starving, it would be feeding us Cheetos. Their natural food, hydrilla and water hyacinth, has a much better nutrient composition. It has what they need. It has the fiber that they need because they are herbivores. And so the herbivore is an animal that eats just plants like cows and sheep. And so they require fiber, and hydrilla and water hyacinth have what they need. And I know this because the work that I did, the manatee research that I did, looked specifically at manatee feeding preferences and which freshwater plants do they prefer when compared to lettuce. Lettuce was at the very bottom of the list. They had a much higher preference for hydrilla and water hyacinth.
Interesting to me. Tell me about how we got to the lettuce being the answer when it's not really the answer, and how do we get to the point where we are actually feeding them the things through FWC, which I'm guessing is the Florida Wildlife Commission.
Yes.
How do we get the food that they need to them?
Well, to answer your first question, when I've inquired with and thank you for clarifying that, the FWC, I'm so used to using acronyms. The FWC is the Florida Wildlife Conservation Commission. They're the state agency that oversees the wildlife management, conservation management of all wildlife in the state. And when I inquired with one of the top biologists, when are they going to start feeding them hydrilla and water hyacinth, I was told that they were feeding them lettuce because, and this is what anybody in almost any of the articles that you read about where they're talking about the feeding program, they'll mention that lettuce is what is fed to captive animals, captive manatees. When they're rescued and brought into captivity at SeaWorld or some of the other rescue areas, they feed them lettuce. The problem is wild manatees do not recognize lettuce as a food. That's a human produce. It's not anything that they've ever seen in the wild. So even wild manatees do not immediately start eating lettuce when they go into a rehabilitation facility. Instead, they will place those newly brought in animals with an animal that's been in rehab for a while. That animal has learned to eat lettuce. And so the new manatee will learn to eat lettuce by watching one of its peers. The other thing that they do in rehab is, one, they have veterinarians available to treat those animals with antibiotics and to evaluate them and to provide them with whatever veterinary care they may need. Plus, they supplement that lettuce with a number of other types of produce and vitamin supplements. So the problem is they're just feeding them lettuce in the IRL. Again, animals that are emaciated, starving, animals that haven't eaten in about 3 months. And I'll explain why that's a serious problem for this particular population. But they're just giving them lettuce with none of the other supplements that an animal in a rehabilitation facility would receive. So when they're telling the public, yes, we're feeding them lettuce and the manatees are eating it, what they're not telling them is that there's a number of manatees that are former rehab manatees that are part of the Northern Indian River, the Indian River Lagoon population, because that population was made up of about 1,100 animals, some of them permanent residents, some of them that would migrate down south and then come back in the wintertime to the IRL. Some of those animals have been in rehabilitation. So what I believe, this is my own personal speculation, what I believe they were hoping would happen would be the same thing that happens in captivity. Those animals that had seen lettuce before because they had been in rehabilitation would start to eat the lettuce, and then the wild manatees would follow suit. And that is what happened to a degree. At one point, according to the news reports, at least 50 manatees were eating, or less than 50, sorry, make it right, less than 50 were eating lettuce. I'm not sure exactly what the number is right now, but they're not there now because it's warm. There would only be the permanent residents that would tend to be there now to eat it. But there were some that ate it, and there were likely some wild manatees that followed suit and imitated their peers. But we're talking about a group of at least 500 animals. November 27th, one of the things I was really concerned about was the fact that the FWC chose not to do aerial surveys this year. They also didn't do them last year. Last year, I understand why. They said it was due to COVID. This year, however, I was not sure why they were not going to do an aerial survey. And I've been involved in unusual mortality events before in my career. And one of the things you really want to do is make sure that you know how many animals you've lost. With the Indian River Lagoon population, they collected manatee carcasses last year, but they didn't collect them all because there's no way, unless you run a drone or an airplane and actually do a search of the area, that you're going to find all of the manatees that have died. So they, the number that they report are the number that people found and called in. And so you always want to know, okay, well, we know how many we picked up, whether through rescue or for necropsy being animal autopsies. But you always want to reevaluate, well, how many do we have left? And that was something that evidently they chose not to do this year. I, as a scientist, understanding it's important to know how many animals you have in your population during and after you and me, was able to work with Bear Warriors United. Katrina Shaddix is their executive director. And together we were able to get eyes in the sky in order to see how many animals were there on November 27th, which was the Saturday after Thanksgiving. We'd had 2 weeks of cold weather. Manatees cannot live in cold water. They have to go to a warm water area. And so the Florida Power and Light facility there in the Indian River Lagoon is the equivalent of the Blue Spring or Crystal River's Three Sister Springs that you may hear of manatees going to. That's the equivalent for them. It's their warm water refuge. So we got eyes in the sky over there, and there were over 400 animals there at that point in time with absolutely nothing to eat because,
oh my gosh,
there's nothing in the Indian River Lagoon. If anybody has been there recently, I mean, I don't know if you have gone in years past when there were just seagrass meadows everywhere, and that was what the manatees would live on in the wintertime. It was cold. They would be in the warm water refuge, but then they would venture out to eat seagrass in the middle of the day and then run back to the warm water, during the evening when it was cold. There's nothing there. I've been there several times. It's just a desert there with absolutely nothing for them to eat. And real quick, the reason why I was saying the fact that they hadn't eaten in about 3 months, at least by this time, they haven't eaten in about 3 months. The reason why that is important is because this particular population, and this is actually kind of the canary in the mine, even during the summer, they're not getting enough food. Some of the manatees that stay there have to wander around the Banana River, Mosquito, that particular area looking for food. And some of them might head up north towards Georgia for the migratory ones. But the ones that migrate towards the south of Florida, our seagrass meadows or beds down there are also in decline. So unfortunately, these animals aren't even getting enough to eat during the summer. They're getting enough to get by, but they aren't getting enough to build their bodies back after spending winter in a place that had no food.
Wow.
So the manatees that were there last year, they survived, but then they go out and during the summer, they're just kind of barely finding enough to eat. So they came back this winter, this fall, or this past November, and they were already compromised in terms of their health. So if you have an animal that's already malnourished, not finding anything to eat, those that are still alive, I am amazed that they are still alive because basically they've gone with little to nothing to eat for the past.
So how do we had a question, what can we do to help? How do we stop the starve?
One of the things that we've really been encouraging people to do is to write emails rather, and call the FWC Commission, the commissioners. That's a group of gentlemen who run the FWC. They make decisions for the FWC. Also the governor, because ultimately the governor is the one who has the power to say, hey, FWC, get the proper food to these manatees, get hydrilla and water hyacinth to these manatees so that this population does not go extinct, because that is what we're looking at with this particular population is what we call a local population extinction event. The FWC has said that they have modeled it and that there's a low chance of that, but I know for a fact from people who know for a fact that there have been 4 to 14 animals, or carcasses rather, being recovered from the IRL since December. So that's a lot of animals that have died, and they're being collected so that they're not out there in the lagoon. But the thing is that's if the feeding program were working, then the manatees would not be dying at that rate. So definitely sending emails to the commissioners, asking them to please feed the manatees, hydrilla, and water hyacinth, and the governor, because this is an election year, and I know he doesn't want to have this particular situation on his hands, you know, when he knows that manatees are something that are iconic and unique to Florida. No other state, and actually no other place in the world, has manatees. There are other species of manatees in other places, but nobody else has the manatee that we have. So this is our own personal marine mammal that is dying in this area.
It's tragic, just like you said. Before we head out, we have somebody, Trinice, is asking, is there a place we can donate to stopthestarve.org, a place that people can donate to a cause, donate to help, or is that to get people involved? Is there a way for people to help with monetary donations?
The primary, I know that the Florida Wildlife Federation has a website that people have been donating to them for lettuce. The thing is, they have explained that the cost of transporting hydrilla and water hyacinth, in terms of the reasons that they give, I call them excuses, but the politically correct term would probably be reasons that they give, is that they say that it's too expensive to transport it. They say that it'll turn to mush before they can get it to the manatees, which isn't true, because there are locations next to, not too far from the IRL, within an hour, that the plants can be mechanically harvested and brought to the lagoon within an hour or two, and placed in different areas at this point, because the manatees are in various parts of the lagoon now. They're not just in one spot. Right. And it won't turn to mush. I know that from experience. But one quick thing I want to mention is that the FWC and a number of other groups, agencies, companies spray the hydrilla and the water hyacinth that could be used to feed the manatees. And we have been encouraging them and asking them to stop spraying these plants and instead mechanically harvest them and give them to the manatees. And they refuse to do that. So monetary donations, yes, if you give them to the Florida Wildlife, the FWC's foundation, ideally, maybe at some point in time, it would go towards harvesting hydrilla and water hyacinth. But I would think people would need to stipulate, this is what I want my donation to go towards. I want it to go towards the cost of transporting and mechanically harvesting unsprayed hydrilla and water hyacinth for the manatees in the Indian River Lagoon. And Ted, there's still a lot of management issues that need to be addressed, and Katrina Shaddix and I continue to work with the FWC or communicate with them, I should say, and trying to get these management decisions made in order to benefit this population. Because again, right now we're looking at an extinction event for this group.
It's beyond tragic. It breaks my heart. All right, stopthestarve.org. Write letters, write emails, make calls. Get with your local politicians, your local community leaders. Go to stopthestarve.org to learn more. Dr. Jones, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing about this. It is a true crisis, and I appreciate you shedding some light on it and showing us how we can try to help make a difference.
Well, thank you so much again for being willing to share this information with the public, because it's important that they hear, they hear what's going on, what the media reports, they read what the media reports, but it's also important for them to know the truth of what is not being told to them, because there's a lot that's not being told to the public that needs to be told.
That's why we do these kinds of shows, to bring out the real stuff. Thank you, Dr. Jones. Stopthestarve.org, everybody. We'll see you soon. Please get involved. Bye-bye.
Please do. Bye-bye.